Apparently, we are on. That's my belief. Let me know if we are actually coming through. Let me know if it's actually working. I think it is. Welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Just in case you're new here, this is the patrons only newscast, which means that there's basically no. There's no moderation, of course, because y'all are patrons, but we're not doing one single presentation. I've presented, 12, 13 different items I want to talk about, some of which were selected by patrons, some of which patrons asked me to talk about. I'm just going to answer every comment as we go. So I'll talk about one item, and then I'll see what everybody has to say. We rarely have more than 5-10 folks show up here live. I think most patrons consume this after the fact as sort of a semi-podcast. But I'm very grateful for the folks who are here and always excited to discuss. Russia invaded Ukraine. It's kind of an extraordinary moment, and it's hard to really. I think what's different about this moment is the extent to which what does make this moment unique since 1945, or possibly the Vietnam War, but really I think since 1945 is the degree to which the world is dependent on the outcomes here. We've certainly seen wars against resource providers in the past, but I think everybody knew that Russia was a massive oil and gas producer. But I think what was less appreciated by most people, certainly by me, was the degree to which Ukraine is an incredibly important commodities provider as well. There's not a ton of oil and gas in Ukraine, but there's a range of really useful minerals, and most importantly, Ukraine and Russia are, I believe, number 2 and number 3 after the United States, or might even be higher than the United States when it comes to the international export of grain. So we're in a position where the entire world is dependent on what happens in this conflict with Russia and Ukraine. I just did a short. I'd forgotten I was supposed to do a short this morning, and basically just did a quick riff. We have no idea what's going to happen. It's in some ways, I think for nerds like me, or potentially nerds like us, if you'll forgive me for saying so, this can be exciting in some way because it really is, everything's up in the air, but just the horror of what we could be about to face as a planet is something we really need to pay attention to. Me here in New York City, I'm not going to deal with food insecurity, but there's a distinct chance that a lot of the country will, dependent on what happens over the coming weeks in Russia and Ukraine. At this point, we're now dealing with 2 solid weeks of disruption of oil networks, gas networks, wheat, other food products. And 2 weeks of disruption is something that the market can handle. Almost all countries, including developing ones, have reserves of certain commodities. So at this point, it's possible to imagine everything gets resolved. We get another burst of inflation. Things are a little uncomfortable in a few places for a little while, and then the world just sort of moves on as normal. But that is not a likely possibility. That is a possibility. It's entirely possible that Russia will just decide, Russia with or without Putin, will decide in the next week or so that this conflict has been a huge loser. Will negotiate with Ukraine to get what it can get, and will pull out. That's a possibility. What's interesting in that question, in that set of circumstances, is what does that mean? Does that mean that all of a sudden Russia is welcomed back? All of these corporations that have angrily abandoned Russia over the past 2 weeks, then it comes streaming back? Or is Russia going to have some kind of weird mediated involvement? Oil and gas will continue. Not for very long, as Europe gets more and more committed to not taking Russian oil and gas. But will Russia continue as this sort of North Korea of this sort of European North Korea, this sort of satellite of China that just gets more and more authoritarian, grimmer, and isolated? Honestly, I think unless Putin falls, I think that's the most likely result. I think that's what's going to happen. I think that absolutely we can avert a crisis in terms of food supplies, oil, gas everywhere, if Russia just gives up and pulls out. But I do think that Russia has significantly changed their position in the world for all time, or at least for the duration of the Putin government. It's just, yeah, I mean, extraordinary changes here. But keep in mind that what I'm talking about there, that's the best case scenario. Because I was actually tempted. I mean, I think Odessa is something we all need to watch very closely. I think it's been an assumption for 2 weeks now. The Ukrainians have been prepping for an attack against Odessa. Odessa is the biggest port in Ukraine. Is it the third largest city in Ukraine? Regardless, it's a tremendously important economic hub, trading hub. All the wheat and other commodities that Ukraine provides to the world market travel out of Odessa. So obviously, the infrastructure within Odessa is extremely important. That may already be fading to some degree. Did they? There's already the Ukrainian Navy. Is it scuttled in the port of Odessa? I'm not entirely certain. Defensive measures that the Ukrainians may be taking may already be putting the Odessa port out of commission in some ways. But yeah, the question of whether, if Russia goes into Odessa, we're talking about a new level of damage. We're talking about that would be Russia making the decision to double down. There's been some question basically over the past 3 or 4 days now: is Russia in a sort of pause in its efforts? Is it marshaling strength and building up force to do an onslaught, or is it really just completely stymied and trying to figure out if they can get a good deal out of Ukraine before they have to lose more guys? I don't know. I would still lean more towards Russia is just reformulating before making a bigger attack. And so what happens in Odessa is tremendously important. If that infrastructure gets destroyed, and also just the symbolic importance of Odessa, if Russia decides to go and take Odessa, then that signifies that this is not going to be a 2 or 3 week or 1 month conflict. This is going to be a 6-month conflict, something in those lines. Because nobody expects that even if Russia manages to take Kyiv and Odessa in the next 2 or 3 weeks, nobody expects this conflict to stop. And in that eventuality, we are talking about, I was just looking this morning, Russia provides about 10% of the world's oil consumption. It's produced by Russia. And that oil has been, this week, sort of politically untouchable. Shell got into a lot, in the past couple of weeks, I think. Shell oil got in a lot of trouble for buying some bargain priced Russian oil. I think that's going to fade very quickly, sort of that, and of course, the United States famously blocked Russian oil just in the past couple of days. I feel like that's going to fade as we get back. I think we've fallen from $130 a barrel down to 110. I think that rise will continue in the coming weeks if the conflict continues. And I bet that people are going to be a lot less filled with scrutiny if Russia tries to sell its oil. But if Russia goes into Odessa, if the horror and the destruction of civilian life that requires goes up dramatically, then maybe I'm wrong. Maybe actually, the world will decide to do without Russian oil. And it is interesting because this is absolutely an energy crisis on the scale of the 1970s, no question. I think Javier Blas on Twitter has called that, I think, last week at some point. No question that that's the case. But what's different this time around is that we really do have alternatives. We really do have things that the U.S. shale industry can do. We have things that the Gulf oil industries can do. We can get back in bed with Iran and Venezuela, which I really hope we will do. There's just infinitely. So yeah, basically everything is up in the air. But I really do think we should be thinking more about the real prospects and possibilities of worldwide starvation. Might oversell it a little bit, but worldwide food insecurity. That's, of course, famously is seen as one of the most one of the motivations that were most strongly behind the Arab Spring in 2011. Already in 2019, before COVID, we were making videos. I made a video called "Protest World," about how it seemed like every country in the world was overflowing with discontent. If you take the ramifications of COVID, which you've been universally horrible, societally speaking. I've been talking for years, laughing at people who claimed that minor crime spikes in the United States were a return to the 1990s and they simply weren't. Looking at the math, I found that laughable. Post-COVID, we do have a situation with crime in the United States that looks more similar to the 1980s and the 1990s. The United States is not the only society that has been traumatized by COVID, to say the least, and it is one of the societies with the most resources to deal with that trauma. So if you're talking about countries all over the world that were already rioting in 2019, have dealt with 2 solid years now, I guess this week, of 2 solid years of COVID-related traumas of all natures. And then food's going to start getting a hell of a lot more expensive. This is not a good set of circumstances for the world's poor or for those who have any investment in world stability. Yeah. So yeah, Russia, they broke everything. I think that's the first item I meant to talk about. Also, yeah, just one note, like we already had a supply chain nightmare, as we've talked about on this channel and elsewhere. Like we already had inflation. We already had a supply chain nightmare. I think President Joe Biden, in a very savvy way, is trying to say, oh, no, that was Putin's fault, too. Because, they've been doing this buildup in Ukraine for over a year now, which is, I think, kind of a hard thing to sell. But, good luck to him. We already had ramifying crises. So it's very strange that so much depends on what happens in this one conflict. I am very sympathetic to folks who think that the focus on these refugees, this suffering, is outsized out of racism. I think that's 100% true, no question. I don't think anybody can dispute that. But we shouldn't allow that I think appropriately woke approach to be outraged by. I mean, what's happening to Indian and African students who are trying to leave Ukraine in Poland is nightmarish. I mean, there's many of things to be scandalized by, but I think it is important to emphasize that because of the size and scale of both the country attacking and the country being attacked, and their systemic importance to world financial system, commodity systems, everything, like this is a huge deal. And yeah, Russia's sort of broken everything. All right, comments. Hello, says Chris. Good morning, says Chris from Murtaugh. Hello. Everything is working. Thanks, folks. Loga is trying to get everybody on the Discord, which I definitely support. If you sign up on the Discord, which I think Loga's probably providing links to that. If you sign up on the Discord, we do this, and we also do a sort of a Zoom call for the patrons once a month as well, which is a lot of fun. I get to sort of see and hear the folks who make this channel possible, so that's fun. So yeah, sign up for Discord, says Loga. That'll be the last time I read one of Logo's comments on the Discord until the end. But yes, I would recommend signing up for the Discord as well, and Logo will probably continue to make that clear to you in the chat as we go forward. Scott Locks, just like Germany fighting to take and keep the Ukraine breadbasket in 1941 to 1945. I think that's true. Some of the significance there is comparable. But the world is much more interlinked and reliant on a few commodity providers than it was at that point. One of the most interesting things, I think, from the perspective of, you guys know, like the Norman Angell controversy, right? There was this guy who wrote a book in the run up to World War One, who said war that was absolutely impossible because of the degree to which everybody was interlinked. I actually read that book, and he was absolutely right. He was right that it would have been insane for anybody to get involved in a world war in the situation that they had at that time. Unfortunately, he underestimated the degree to which Europe's leaders were insane, and that war happened. But people really love when people point out that China and the United States are really intertwined, or there's a lot of things tying us all together today. People love to trot out Norman Angell and make fun of the fact that he overestimated what connection would do. I think there's a really good counter argument to that, bringing up Norman Angell again thing, is that the world prior to World War I and in the interwar period, and even in the 1930s and 1940s, was nowhere near as interweaved. I think we love to talk about how, oh yes, the first period of globalization under the British Empire leading up to World War I, that was real, that was a tremendous shift from everything that had come before, but it was comparatively tiny to the way the world looks now. I think in the 40s, even in the United States, I think we still had 10 to 15% of the population were agricultural workers. But all the other combatants in World War II, mostly provided their own grain. We're now in a situation where a wide swath of countries across the world are dependent on the United States, Ukraine, and Russia to feed themselves. Every country has some degree of agricultural provision of their own, but there are a lot of countries, Egypt, of course, is the most famous one, that are terrifyingly dependent on outside sources of bulk grain. And, in ways that, in functionings of container shipping that weren't even a dream in 1941 to 1945. So, Scott, absolutely, I think that the parallels we're in a situation where parallels to the Nazis, to Nazi operations are 100% fair. I mean, what Putin is doing is pure Nazi behavior. It is unmerited conquest and destruction. And yes, it is in a lot of the same territory where Hitler was committing his horrors. So we're in a situation where those parallels are uniquely quite fair, and I wouldn't be calling Godwin's law. I'm not calling Godwin's law. But there are key differences that I think we have to keep in mind. Let's see here. The price of bread has increased by 60% already in Egypt, says Loga. Yeah, that's pretty horrifying. Wasn't it more due to them wanting their oil? I think we're talking about the Germans in World War II. I think that specifically the Germans did want to do a stab towards, towards Baku, right? Towards Russian, towards Soviet oil. But also, the whole motivating ideology was Lebensraum, for living space for German colonialists in the Slavic territories. So Ukraine's agriculture was definitely something they were thinking of. Spring almost here. Time for farmers to sow wheat. I suppose they will, no matter who is in control. Scott Lux points out, yeah, I think this morning I was researching and Zelensky had a statement for everybody saying, please, 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 sow your wheat. Regardless, we're going to win, but you need to sow your wheat before we win because the conflict could drag on for a while. But yeah, these are really, really vital questions. We take food stability for granted in the world. Even in developing countries, we tend to take food stability for granted. And it's really important that Zelensky is making statements like that and that the Ukrainians plant their wheat. The world really depends on it. Look at both. The Germans didn't starve in World War II like they did in World War I. Rami Ilkic, the oil is in the Caucasus. There is no oil in Ukraine, but it was a staging ground to take the Caucasus in World War II. Nazis failed in 1942 to take the Caucasus and were annihilated in Stalingrad. Yes, thank you, Rami. That all sounds right to me. Scott asks, wasn't there oil in Romania in World War II? Yes, I know for a fact there was oil in Romania in World War II. I don't believe it was on the scale of the oil that was present in anywhere near the same scale of resources that were present in Azerbaijan. Certainly not today. But yeah, Romania was actually a petrostate, I think, in the lead up to World War II. And I believe the Nazis took that fairly quickly, and that was a valuable resource for them. But that's one of those situations where, yes, Romania was a petrostate with its small population. Yes, Romania was, it was an important and lucrative industry for Romania. But on the scale, compared to the scale of the Nazi war machine, it was a drop in the bucket. So yeah. It's funny, yeah, this logo points to something that's really fascinating and just indicates the scale of Putin's failure here. It's funny because Odessa's mayor was a pro-Russian politician. Putin has effectively killed the pro-Russian lobby within Europe. It's pretty extraordinary. I mean, Kharkiv is, I still believe, a predominantly Russian-speaking city. This is, I believe, the second largest city in Ukraine, 25 miles, 10 to 20 miles from the Russian border, Russian-speaking, grand Russian tradition, and Russia has not been able to take it. They've been stymied there as they've been stymied everywhere else. And a lot of the people fighting against, the mayor of Odessa is, of course, a very charismatic example, but I do believe there are a lot of people fighting against Russia in Ukraine today who would have been Russian supporters, maybe not 3 weeks ago, but maybe 3 weeks ago, and certainly 9 years ago, before Russia's invasion of Crimea, and the Eastern separatists, and support for the Eastern separatists. It's funny because, okay, Romanian oil was already under Axis control before they attacked Ukraine. That makes sense. Is that true? I don't know. I don't know my World War II, perhaps as well as Rami does. Under Axis control before they attacked Ukraine, it was not enough for the war. They were desperate for the Caucasus oil, yeah, as I said. I mean, if Putin's fault for inflation, that just means the markets were better predicting this conflict than the national security blob. I saw somebody making that case this morning. That's interesting. Join the Discord, says Loga. Have you joined the picture? Okay. Christopher Monta, been watching Joe blogs on Turkey's reliance on Russian oil. Things were already bleak, but now looks like the economy can collapse before 2023. How can we avoid this triggering all-out war? I mean, what's interesting, the most important thing, I think, for Turkey's oil and gas reliance is there's already pipelines to Iran. And I believe, I had trouble tracking it down exactly the details here, but even though there are long-standing criminal cases and controversies around Turkey's purchase of oil from Iran, I believe they must have some kind of waiver because I believe they are still taking large-scale amounts of gas from Iran. So obviously the JCPOA, or perhaps not even the JCPOA, just some other way of making peace with Iran is tremendously important to that aspect as well. Because I think I would be surprised, I am surprised at this point, I would think that Russia would be using Russia would already be using the oil and gas weapon against Turkey, specifically because of the problems that Turkey is giving Russia in the Bosphorus. But I haven't seen. Maybe it is happening. There's a lot going on, Christopher. I may have missed it, but yeah, it's pretty messed up actually. But I'm now very much rooting for Turkey to repair its relationship with the United States. I think that's a good thing, regardless. Obviously, I'm not very excited for that to redound to the benefit of Erdogan, the guy in charge of Turkey. And so I'm like, well, wait a second. If he can repair relationships and then Turkey runs out of gas and gets a crushing recession, then, maybe he'll lose the election in 2023, which is, I think, I don't think that's a good thought process on my part. But yeah, Christopher, I think Turkey's reliance on gas from Russia is something that needs to be focused on a bit more. But I think they do have the possibility of getting gas from Iran, and also they must have some sources from Iraqi Kurdistan, I would assume. So yeah, that's a very important picture, part of this picture. Doesn't one of the main Russian gas supply lines go through Ukraine? I think a couple of the main Russian gas supply lines go through Ukraine. And it's a really interesting endgame question. Like, what if really the Ukrainian government was about to fall? Wouldn't be that hard to blow up the pipeline. But yeah, there's a lot of very open questions. Or if Russia's entirely forced out, that would be, I think, really an extraordinarily suicidal act. But I can't. Maybe if Russia were forced out of Ukraine, they'd bomb the pipeline as they left. My understanding is some oil and gas infrastructure in Ukraine has already been blown up, but I don't believe it's been sort of systemically important links across Ukraine from Russia to Europe yet. Yet. Um, Ignoring the idiots calling for the no-fly zone is a good start. I agree. We'll talk about the no-fly zone later. And how I am, despite my anger at Joe Biden over many things, I'm really glad he's there now. Certainly over Trump, and even over Obama in some ways. Mert Muftil, Ukraine is paying the price of NATO expansion. We shouldn't get involved militarily more than we already have, but also offer rebuilding funds to Ukraine. Maybe some from seized Russian funds. Potentially. Yeah, Mert, I think obviously Ukraine's paying the price. So I feel like a really, really dangerous trend this year that not enough people are paying attention to. I think there was a guy, Zoltan Pozar, on an Odd Lots podcast, mentioned it. It's like, okay, so we stole the Afghan central bank funds to give it to the 9/11 victims, and now we're going to steal Russian central bank funds to give it to Ukraine. It's just central bank funds and reserve currencies, should be things that countries actually own. And the U.S. ability to sort of seize these assets and pressure folks in ways. Obviously, it's not like a no-fly zone and in some of the other harebrained, insane things that have been proposed. But it is a very real, very imperial, very it's precedents being set. It's things are shifting in ways that are, of course, phenomenal for U.S. empire and U.S. power. But I think we should all be leery of the way that this is used, because I think almost anybody who, certainly anybody on the patrons call here, supports Ukraine against Russia and wants to see Russia suffer and be punished for this. And I would imagine 90% of my broader audience feels that way as well. But it's sort of hard cases make bad law. Our eagerness to punish Russia in this way, we have to keep in mind that these tools will be used to punish Afghans, to punish Iranians, to punish Syrians, to punish Venezuelans, to punish whoever we decide to fight for whatever reason, in decades to come. So I think, yeah, Mert, I think absolutely, like, there needs to be Russian reparations paid, of course, but the degree to which the United States can just sort of say, oh, these were your central bank funds, we're going to give them to Ukraine. That bugs me. I think probably it'll be something that ends up happening, but still it bugs me. How long can Putin keep selling? How long can Putin keep selling Ukraine as a Nazi-loving country that must be rescued to Russia's citizenry? They're going to keep, asks T. Matthews. They're going to keep trying. That's for damn sure. What that's going to mean internally, I think, is a really interesting question. I haven't been following it as closely as I'd like. There's a lot to follow right now, but there's some really intriguing senses of Kremlin insiders saying surprisingly brave things on on state television. Just all kinds of strange. There's apparently over 10,000 Ukrainian Russians are in jail right now for protesting the war. I think the appropriate assumption to make is that Putin will continue to be able to crush dissent and keep his control. But I don't know. But it's an interesting question, T. Matthews. It's a very interesting question. How long can Putin keep selling this? He didn't think I think most agree he didn't think he'd have to sell it for more than 48 hours or a week at most. I think he'd already expected to have had some victories by now and for this conflict to be over. That is not what has happened. Mark Mufti, I think it's even crueler than that. Zelensky was led on that there was a chance of joining NATO, which obviously interpreted as a road to the EU, but Ukraine would never have joined. Well, what's interesting is that this is a possibility I would be a huge fan of, is that there's a possibility that Ukraine could end up in the EU. Supposedly, they're already on a fast track to membership. There was some diplomacy around that. Was that last week or the week prior? It would be phenomenal if Ukraine ended up joining the EU, but not NATO. I think that would be a tremendously positive development in sort of European and world politics. But yeah, no, I think that I don't know if I need to do this. Well, who else will? But I do think there needs to be a bit of an excavation of just how badly the Trump-Biden combo misled Zelensky. To have Trump and his sort of insanity. Remember, of course, Trump got impeached over his way of dealing with Ukrainian relations. But what's really interesting is that Trump was impeached for not doing something that Obama refused to do, which was provide heavy arms to Ukraine. Obama argued that providing heavy arms to Ukraine would result in a Russian invasion, and Obama was entirely right about that. So yeah, I think there needs to be a lot more serious coverage of what exactly happened over the 8 years. And I think this actually, the 8 years, and this I think actually leads well into my next point. But which is that the United States is winning a pretty dumb game. Because it would be viewed by a few nations. Ada, yes, even crueler logo. Turkey gets gas from Azerbaijan. I think I read somewhere that Turkey got gas from USA too last year, a significant amount. Wow, that's crazy. It's liquefied natural gas ports are incredible. I mean, it's just science fiction stuff. We take this stuff out of the ground. In specialized ports, we freeze it through a tremendously costly and energy costly process into a liquid form that can only be transferred in certain kinds of plants, and then they go across the world to other ports, regasification plants, where they are in these other very specialized ports where they are turned back from liquid into gas. And then, I mean, it's sci-fi stuff. I didn't know Turkey had the regasification ports, but it makes sense that it would. It's a top 20 economy, and it's just it's quite stunning. And Skylark says almost 1 million Russians and Ukrainians died in 1941 in the Battle of Kyiv fighting Germans. Surreal they are fighting each other. Is divide and conquer the U.S. strategy? 100% divide and conquer is the U.S. strategy, and boy, is it working. It's really quite stunning how I think. I'm not tempted, but I could see many people being tempted to go rah rah America over this, because the stunning victory that we're seeing of the United States over Russia right now is, even if Russia rallies, somehow conquers the parts of Ukraine that he wants, or is able to leave, which I think is plausible with some kind of face-saving deal, even if, I mean, it's never going to change the fact that the Russian army was shelling Kharkiv or shelling Kyiv or shelling Mariupol. That's never not going to be the case. This has been an extraordinary victory for the United States. This is a situation, as I think you all well know, I'm somebody who takes a pretty grim take on what the U.S. has been doing over the past 20 years in foreign policy. There's not a grim take. There is a grim. Let me clarify. There is a grim take here, but in the very limited sense of what's going on right now, there's no nuance here. It's we can look at the history, and the history is important. And I've spent time on my channel putting forward that history. I think I tweeted this a couple days back. Like I am very interested in hearing about your grievances as a country. Why things got to this point. I become much less interested when you use those grievances to stab your neighbor. And that's what Russia has done. Like, Russia's the bad guy here. I know I am somewhat desperate, I do seem somewhat desperate looking for situations where the United States is not, in fact, the bad guy. And something I really like about the conflict in Ethiopia. That's not our fault. While I wouldn't go quite that far with Ukraine and Russia, I would say that we absolutely built up and are heavily arming Ukraine right now. People get weirded out when I refer to the Ukrainian military as a U.S. proxy force, but that's 100% what it is. But that is a fact, that is a historical fact, that's something we need to keep front and present and be aware of. But the simple fact is, it's Russia that decided to start this war. Russia is the aggressor. Russia are the bad guys. And I believe there are sinister aspects to what we were doing, sort of carving off Ukraine, creating Ukraine as an anti-Russia force. It's something we've been doing for 20 years. Putin's not wrong about that. That's something the United States has done. That's very problematic, but now it looks heroic. And I don't mean that like it looks heroic. No, I mean it looks heroic. It looks like it was the right thing to do. I certainly have critiques of that, and will make critiques of that in the future, but now is not the time, quite simply. It's not the fucking time. Because Russia is pulling a poor man's George W. Bush. And that is the biggest problem in the world right now. That is endangering everything. That is endangering Ukraine. That is endangering Russia. That is endangering Egypt, the rest of Africa, any developing country that's dependent on grain exports. It's endangering everything, and Russia is the bad guy. The United States is winning. There's a interesting Francis Fukuyama article that I linked in the description that I think you should read. It is just mind-blowingly optimistic. This is Francis Fukuyama. He's the end of history guy who I believe is unfairly mocked for his end of history thesis, because actually I haven't, but apparently if you read the book, Francis Fukuyama, his end of history thesis, he actually predicts almost everything that has happened. His point was that, sure, history has ended, but people find dumber shit to fight over. And I think both Al-Qaeda and Vladimir Putin provide examples of folks of course, the entire U.S. foreign policy for the past 20 years provide examples of people finding dumber shit to fight over. Francis Fukuyama has this article, which is just like, what I expect to happen is for Russia's assault to fall apart. I expect Putin to fall, and worldwide authoritarianism and anti-democracy will suffer a crushing blow, and will expect a happy march into the future. I mean, it's a mind-blowingly optimistic article. That's actually a possibility right now. Like, I think it's way too optimistic. I don't think things are going to go as well as Fukuyama expects, but they totally could. Or, we could end up in World War III. I think Fukuyama's result is more likely than the annihilation of the human species. That's a plus. But it is just sort of striking how positive he is about that. And I think a lot of folks are, no opinion on Twitter would be an example of this. Folks are just getting absolutely euphoric at the prospect of a real Cold War. This is something that they've obviously wanted for quite some time. And people are really, really excited about this. And I think to some extent their excitement is justified, because we've just watched Russia just absolutely jump off a cliff. I think I should mention, I talk a lot, and I'm a little reductive about this. I talk a lot about how folks, all U.S. foreign policy is about selling weapons. And at root, I do believe that is the case. I think I'm usually careful to say I don't think anybody's sort of evil about this or really believes that, their main goal is Raytheon's bottom line. It's just people who are paid by Raytheon through different channels or other defense industry folks or the Pentagon, and convince themselves that their convince themselves that that they're actually defending the United States or defending the U.S. interest or defending freedom more broadly, despite the almost infinite counter evidence. But there's another aspect to this that is, I think, a more conscious thing. And when I look at the stuff that Noah Smith puts out on Twitter, is the guy who's blocked me. Guy who's was one of my favorite guys on Twitter who blocked me. But I think underlying what he puts out and what a lot of other people put out is, I think, an interesting sort of way of thinking about stuff that is maybe not even wrong, but I think is bad for the world. And this is this idea that, oh, the United States is so divided, the United States has all these problems, so what we need is an enemy. And I see that in a lot of places. We need something to fight against. We need something. I mean, John McCain was actually very big on, we need to build a bigger national consciousness, and we need to, the United States defined itself for 80 years as being anti-communist, and we can't do that anymore, so we need to find something new. We need a new enemy. And a new enemy will unite us and bring us back together. And I think a lot of the euphoria you're seeing on Twitter from a lot of folks is this idea that, we've created a new enemy, so now we can really, unify a little bit more. And I think there's people who just, even before, I mean, this is to some extent, I think neocon is a very loaded term, but just sort of the broader war nerd caucus in the 1990s that was desperately looking for a fight. And welcomed 9/11 because it was a fight. That was the same thinking that we need an enemy will tie us together. And it's I think it's as an American I find that vaguely as a U.S. citizen I find that vaguely charming, that sort of idea. It's like, well, it's kind of cute, but also as somebody who has lived abroad and has some respect or concern for what everybody else in the world might think, it is insane. It is an insane evil. This concept that, if we just had an enemy, we'd be able to have a better healthcare system in the United States. Like if we just, and it's worked. Like the whole civil rights movement is largely. I think it would be overly cynical to call it exclusively a result of the Cold War, but the Cold War had a lot to do with why the civil rights movement was able to succeed in the United States, and it is just so extraordinarily selfish and extraordinarily morally abject to be like, what? It's worth having a massive proxy war where a whole bunch of Ukrainians die in order for us to be able to have slightly better politics at home and like pull together a little bit better. But that is 100% a subtext of like, the Project for a New American Century folks in the 90s that gave us the nightmare of the War on Terror. And that I believe is a very heavy subtext of, I think, like, I don't think Noah Smith has ever been explicit about this, but I feel like it's, or maybe he's probably got an article saying as much, but yeah, this is totally what his political project is about. Like, we're going to be able to make some vaguely social democratic, mostly neoliberal changes in the United States because we get the foreign unity over creating a situation where a bunch of heroic people die facing some evil bad guys. So it's like I get that instinct. I've seen that among friends of mine, but I also just think it's horrific because it's like we're going to screw up the world and turn the world into a darker, more violent place, so we can feel better about ourselves. And that's so it's the United States is winning a dumb game. Like we didn't have to do any of this. We didn't have to let Russia descend into a nightmare of corruption and disgustingness. We didn't have to justify Putin's hyper-nationalism and paranoia at every turn with NATO expansion. We didn't have to cut Russia out of everything. We didn't have to look for every opportunity to humiliate the country. We didn't have to push the Orange Revolution, which might have. The thing is, like, Ukraine almost certainly organically would have gotten to a better place without the United States so obviously being there, being like, hey, we're here to fuck shit up, which we were from the Orange Revolution in 2004 that put U.S. friendly folks in power who were so corrupt and bad at their job that they lost elections to Yanukovych, who had been unseated. In 2014, we absolutely helped kick out a democratically elected president. Absolutely in 2014. And then used Ukraine as a football in domestic politics under the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations. These were all choices that we made, and they're working. You know, they're working really well. If your goal is to create a scary bad guy in Russia that we can make fun of and isolate, and I think it's only 2 weeks in. I expect the effect to fade, but yeah, there is a bit of the effect. Biden's approval rating has gone up. Really contentious things like Venezuela and Iran policy are, there's some pushback, but it looks possible that those issues could be more or less solved because we've got a real big Russian baddie to fight again. And yeah, that works, but like, what a terrible thing to do. What a terrible thing to do to Russia. What a terrible thing to do to Ukraine. What a terrible thing to do to everybody in the poorer world that's dependent on Russian oil and gas and Russian and Ukrainian wheat and other foods. It's just a shitty game, and we're winning. Yay. It's very sad, I think. But at the same time, it's nice to see Putin get humiliated. That's a plus. But it also seems pretty grim. Anyway, and a non-0% chance of World War III. Like, we are 100% in a more fraught position than we were during the Cold War. Like, what if Cuba was Texas? Like, that's sort of the extent of Cuban Missile Crisis we're in right now, and that's pretty grim. Okay, let's see. We've got comments, 10 viewers. Woohoo! Yeah, we're 11 patrons here. That's extraordinary. That's a lot of folks. I'm gonna try to make it through these comments a little more quickly because we're still on point 1 and we're almost halfway through the time here. Azerbaijan has pipelines to Turkey and through Turkey to Italy. Yes, very much so. And Azerbaijan is a huge supplier, but Turkey is a country of 80 million that 80 million plus that surprisingly I think has very little oil and gas resources, surprisingly little for that area. So Turkey is almost entirely dependent on imports. Azerbaijan is a huge producer, Iran's a huge producer, Russia is a huge producer, and all of them saw Turkey as an important enough market to have pipelines going there. In some cases through Turkey, but so Turkey has a tremendous demand for oil and gas. Brando Commando had midterms this week, so I haven't been able to tune into your last 2 live streams. Well, Brando, you're welcome here. Sorry that took your time. Haftar is threatening to cut off 1 million barrels of oil if Dabibah does not hand over power to Bashaga. Libya, man. Libya. Libya, it's a mess. And kind of more systemically important, of course, because the 1.5 to 2 million barrels a day that Libya can provide became are much more important than they were 3 weeks ago. I do wonder if Haftar, this is the Russia, UAE, Saudi, French supported strongman in the East who failed to take the country in 2020, I guess. Yeah, it was 2020. It started in 2019, was pushed back finally in 2020 due to Turkish intervention, I believe. So Haftar, I kind of wonder if without his Russian client and with UAE and Saudis perhaps looking for a reason to look more friendly and solving other problems to focus on Russia, they aren't there yet, but they could be. I feel like Haftar might be overplaying his hand a little bit here, attempting to set up his own prime minister in rivalry to the UN set up Prime Minister Dabibah. But yeah, Libya, another interesting question. Scott Lux, yep. The U.S.'s greatest advantages is that it doesn't share its borders with an equal opponent since the early 1800s. Yep, that's definitely worked out well for us. Brandon Commander, hope you did well. Fadel, since the Cold War, the U.S. has robbed hundreds of millions of people of wealth they could have had. That's true. Also, though, I think that the U.S. system, I think the U.S. world system has also provided benefits, has provided the fact that all of these Egyptians are fed by Ukraine is something that's only really possible in the context of the U.S. world system, or I suppose the British world system before it. I think that if you consider like the scale of U.S.'s guilt versus benefits provided, I think you have to consider the amount of chaos that could be the case if the U.S. were to have not been there. Yeah, I mean, the Nazis probably wouldn't have run a particularly good European or world system. The Soviets, yeah, I don't think they would have done particularly well either. Yeah, the British Empire, better than Nazis or the Soviets, but pretty fucking grim. So, yeah. But I think, yeah, I mean, yes, obviously the U.S. should always strive to do better. But that's, part of the mission of this YouTube channel. Yeah, the U.S. robbed hundreds of millions of people of wealth they could have had. I'm mostly, well, yeah, I mean, no question that the United States destroyed the Middle East over the past 20 years to no purpose. To no purpose. And, has made oil more expensive and put Israel in more danger, which are our main interests in the Middle East. And there are hundreds of millions of people there, so I guess, Fadel, your point is entirely valid. Local extreme, Fadel, the counter to that was it helped bring hundreds of millions out of poverty in East and Southeast Asia, thanks to opening its markets and building free economic juggernauts. Well, thank you, Logan. Speaking up for America. True, the U.S. let Asia develop, but it did not let MENA and large parts of Africa develop. No question that our 20 years of warring have crushed MENA. No excuse for that. I'm not, well, yeah, and our past 10 years crushed Africa as well. But I don't think it was intentional. It was intentional in MENA, in the Middle East, North Africa. But in Africa, I don't think it was intentional. I guess that doesn't really make it sound much better, does it? Brando Commando, what are the odds we end up with two competing financial systems? The U.S.-led financial system is the jewel in the crown of the West, and I think weaponizing it in this way will have bad consequences. I agree that weaponizing it this way will have bad consequences. I think we're seeing bad consequences. Yeah, I think that 20 years ago, I don't think that the U.S. would have thought to just steal Afghanistan's central bank reserves the way we did on the way out. I don't think that would have occurred to people as something that was appropriate to do. But there's no question, this is the real Thucydides trap I've talked about, that the United States is doing what Athens did, and more the structures that were used to sort of defend the free world, to win a big victory over the Soviets, those structures are hardening, and it's going from a less of a voluntary coalition into more of a progressively more and more brutal, hard empire, which obviously is not something I'm a fan of. What's interesting, so Brando Commando, I 100% agree that this abuse of the U.S. System is something that financial system, sanctions, FATCA, a whole range of things, just the use of the U.S. court system, asserting more and more universal jurisdiction for the Southern District of New York court system in ways that are very little publicized and really quite sinister. I agree that 100% that that in the long run makes U.S. dollar diplomacy, dollar supremacy, and just financial hegemony much less powerful, much less likely. I think what's interesting, and in part, this dynamic means it is also dangerous to the United States. I've talked about this before, that letting the mask slip is a really big problem for the United States. Part of what has made U.S. empire, the U.S. world system, so powerful is that we're not as open about the amount of power we have. We can exert it in quiet ways, but what's a real frustration in the post 9/11 era, Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden, is that now with the way we use sanctions, we're just rubbing people's faces in it, especially with the Europeans, who none of whom wanted to give up on the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. Sorry. So what is a bad thing in that it makes U.S. power a little more apparent, but in the short term is kind of a good thing for U.S. empire, or at least seems like a victory, is the extent to which Russia thought it had sanction-proofed itself. Russia thought it had built up the reserves necessary to fight a fight. It thought that it was going to be fine without the U.S. system. I think Russia made a big bet on a post-U.S. financial system, an anti-U.S. financial system, and that big bet lost. Or rather, I mean, the European Union decided it wasn't interested in being part of that alternative financial system. And I think we're, on the one hand, Brando Commando, we're seeing an alternative financial system being built. Like there's, I think it's yuanization. That's a terrible way to, I'm sure I've mispronounced that, but the renminbi, the yuan, two names for the Chinese currency, that system is becoming dramatically more important in Russia day by day. Russia has been cut off from the U.S. and European financial bloc, and is being roped in to the Chinese financial bloc, and that is a tremendously significant thing. You know, adding Russia's oil and gas resources, there may not be the pipelines necessary to get those resources to China at this moment, but in roping them together as a more serious financial bloc is a very significant development. And I think that this was one reason why it's really important that the United States work to grab Venezuela back and brown-nose Iran until it brings itself back over to sort of the U.S.-led system, because it's really in our interest that more people don't join this Russia-China bloc, financial bloc. Then that's a very bad thing. That is a step against U.S. Financial control. But also, it's kind of a club, at least in these early days, it looks like a club that nobody really wants to join. It looks like kind of a shitty club. And I think even China's a little ambivalent about, like, wait a second, like, and I think there's definitely some interesting things that the United States and Europe could do to perhaps get China more interested in isolating Russia. But yeah, no question. That's a very good question, Brandon. Haftar is threatening. I think I did that already, didn't I? Yes. What are the odds we wind up with two competing financial systems? Brando Commando, at this point, the closest any currency has come to challenging the USD was the German mark in the 1970s, and to some extent crypto. I would argue to no extent crypto, but certainly in the hype crypto. But yeah, I think the 70s German mark was a competitor, the Swiss franc back then, pound sterling, the Japanese yen. I think a lot of people were really, in the 80s and 90s, folks really thought, Japan was taking over and the yen was super important. I don't think crypto's anywhere near on that scale. And it's been very interesting. This is exactly the situation where crypto's supposed to go through the roof, and it really hasn't, which is an interesting point. If Dabeba refuses to hand over power to Bashaga and Haftar blocks the oil, the civil war will reignite. And that would be a goddamn shame. Brando Commando, this is... Yeah, I would hope there's somebody in the Biden administration paying attention to what's going on in Libya right now, and doing what we can to actually shut down Haftar and Bashaga. Brando Commando, this will be the Yon's big chance to control Russia's markets and industry. Germany rearming, Scott Locke says, how plausible is it that the EU tells the US that deciding what the EU states do is over the next 10 years? Nord Stream, So Germany rearming means that Russia gets more and more nervous about Germany, and it's hard to imagine a context in which Germany eagerly discards U.S. backup. Yeah, just history dictates that Russia has to get more nervous about Germany rearming. Though what the hell Russia looks like in 3 days or 5 years or 10 years at this point is pretty open to me. I don't know. Um, I think that if Russian-German rivalry continues to be a factor, um, then it then the EU is probably actually going to get closer to the U.S. But what happens if we do get regime change in Russia? Somehow it all holds together, and we get somebody trying to get into the EU under Navalny or something. Well, that's a different question. And yeah, the fact that Germany is armed up, I think already, even if Russia competition continues to be a problem, I think the era where the U.S. could get, well, I mean, theoretically, it was more NATO that dragged the U.S. into this than the other way around. But I think adventures like the one in Libya become less likely. Though I don't know, because I know the EU would probably like the U.S. to put more resources into Africa right now. But truly insane shit like, oh hey, let's go knock over Gaddafi, or oh hey, let's go occupy Afghanistan for 20 years. I feel like there's going to be less of an appetite for that. So there's a possibility, actually, that EU rearming and having more of a say in NATO, because they're actually more of a military power, could make the world a little safer, but I don't know. It's hard to tell. It's a good question, Scott. Fadal, since the fall of Omar Bashir, Sudan has grown much closer to Egypt, and even more now with Burhan in charge. Ethiopia needs to get itself together to avoid conflict with Sudan and Egypt. I think that's a really good point. Because when Sudan and Egypt agree, and these are the two powers that are both on the Nile, it used to be with Ethiopia's Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam that dams up the Nile. It used to have the support of Sudan, but that is no longer the case. So Egypt, if Egypt were to opt for a military solution, they now no longer have to go all the way through Sudan, one of the world's largest countries. They can use Sudan. I don't think we're quite there yet. But yeah, Ethiopia has a range of problems. I spent a little time this morning, and it does seem like it seems like a stalemate continues. I'm sure there's ongoing fighting and dying, but no actor in Ethiopia has yet used the chaos elsewhere to make a move. That'd be interesting. I mean, is Sisi thinking of making a move against Ethiopia? I've always been really skeptical of that prospect, and I really don't think that'd be a good way to make the United States happy right now. But how interested is Egypt in making the United States happy right now? That would certainly be a way for the world conflict to get a lot scarier, a lot quicker, a lot more quickly. But who knows? Who knows what's going to happen there? Comoros is now the only Arab democracy. You may include Malta as well. I don't think the Maltese would include themselves as an Arab democracy. I don't even know what Comoros is. That's embarrassing. I'll have to Google that. That's an island, isn't it? I don't know what Comoros is. Fadl, I still have faith for Tunisia, Morocco, and Jordan, and your input on Saddam's reform makes me much more optimistic about Iraq. I would love to be optimistic about Iraq. I am not optimistic about Tunisia right now. I haven't done a good deep dive recently, but after the coup in July 25th, I mostly expected negative things for Tunisia, and what little I've seen has continued to be negative, which makes me sad. But yeah, I should do a deep dive. It's been too long. Wow, we have not made it through much at all, have we? Okay, so Global South unimpressed. It's been very interesting how and there's been a lot of focus, I think, in U.S. media on just how extraordinarily positive and kumbaya and happy, joy the U.S. and Europe have been about confronting Russia and agreements on sanctions and agreements on military support for the Ukrainians. But I do think there's been a real sense of quiet from the folks who are expected to eventually take over the world. or at least play a much larger role. China has been famously very ambivalent, and India, Russia's firm Cold War ally and sporting a largely Russian-built military, at least at the higher end. India has been very sort of standoffish. It's interesting. There's an Al Jazeera article. Now, is it fair to call Al Jazeera Western-focused media? I think it is fair. I mean, Qatar is essentially a U.S. colony, and there's I think most of the folks who work for Al Jazeera tend to be Anglophone writers. But there was this very interesting article on India, and it was I think they're very much trying to convey a sense of ambivalence. A sense of, Russia, India's got to really watch out. India's really torn over what Russia is doing. And they failed to demonstrate it in the article. I think they put two voices forward in that article who are saying that, India, Modi's being, risking consequences with the Indian public by not jumping on the bandwagon against Russia, and the only people they could find to say something along those lines were a member of the Congress Party, the sort of old school establishment party in India that has just lost a long series of elections and is obviously, as an opponent of Modi's BJP, is just looking for reasons to complain about him. So that wasn't very persuasive. And then the other was I think a woman from the German Marshall Fund, which is sort of a U.S.-German Atlanticist think tank. And I can see why a lot of the developing world would be very ambivalent about this. Yes, we have that really moving speech from the Kenya, whatever, ambassador in the early days, talking about how what Russia's doing is imperialism, and they're very much against it. And I think that probably has some salience, some real appeal, but it's also like, what are these fucking white people doing up there in Europe that's going to make all our food more expensive? And make it harder for us to develop? Great. A bunch of these assholes have again found a way to murder each other and then make it harder for the rest of the world to emerge. I could see. You had the UN General Assembly, which is very meaningless. Most people voting against what Russia was doing, and a lot of folks abstaining. But as this crisis gets worse and things get harder, I could see potentially a lot of real dissent, and a lot of real what the fuck? Why is the entire world suffering for these European problems? And of course, Russia and Putin, the most obvious bad actors here. But there are folks who have a sense of history, and there are intelligence communities. There are folks who pay attention to what's actually been happening in Ukraine over the past 8 years, all over the world. And I think they're pretty aware that the U.S. and the EU played a pretty big role in bringing this conflict about as well. So I think the global South being unimpressed, a lot of how that's going to develop, a lot of how that's going to work going forward, depends on what happens. As I started out this talk today, it's just who knows? What's going on? It's what's going to happen. And if this conflict resolves itself in the next couple of weeks, seems very unlikely, then maybe we'll just sort of move on, and it'll just be another in a long list of sort of insults from the developed world to the developing. Or possibly, if it does drag on and Russia becomes much more brutal and much more baldly, viciously imperial, then maybe, who knows? Maybe more of the global South is like, wow, that looks a lot like the British Empire to me, and fuck that. I don't know. But I do think it's a dynamic that folks need to keep in mind, that we are essentially asking the global South to suffer once again for some dumb war that a bunch of white guys want to get into. Fuddle, I still feel like Scott Lux. AMLO on Ukraine request for weapons from Mexico. We reject the request. We are pacifists. There's a lot about AMLO I don't like, but I do enjoy Scott Lux. Has sort of reminded me just, I think multiple times, just how deeply Mexico is committed to. That's none of our fucking business. And I think that comes out of the tradition of the Mexican Revolution in the teens and 20s when the the teens, yeah, it was the teens, it was the teens, right? Where into the early 20s, where the United States and a number of other folks got really involved in their internal problems. And Mexico's just like, going forward, we are playing no part in any of that. And I really like that about Mexico's tradition beyond AMLO. Local extreme. In Iraq, it depends on whether Sadr can elect the Kurdish president he wants. If not, he'll have to compromise with the Iran-backed bloc. Fadal is just deep into these politics that I need to spend more time on, the Iraqi politics. I finally read a book on Iraqi politics, but it was mostly about sort of the crushing of the Islamic State and did not give me a very granular sense of what's going on in Iraq, unfortunately. This would still be a big step in the right direction, but not as big as Sadr had hoped for. I appear to be breaking up a little, which is bullshit. I'm on Ethernet. I hope that improves. Reject the request for pacifist. In Iraq, it depends on whether Sadr can elect the. This would still be a big step in the right direction, but not as big as Sadr had hoped for. AMLO seems more like a Mexican Corbyn than a Mexican Bernie Sanders. I don't really think there was anything too terribly wrong with, I don't think there's anything too terribly wrong with Corbyn. I would say AMLO is more like a Mexican Trump, I think is the way to put it. What's going on here? We still seem to be streaming. Things still seem to be working, but we seem to be having some trouble here. Let me know if things are working okay. Is Sadr experienced a politician or a populist? Local extreme. He's a populist who has allied himself with technocrats like Al-Kadhimi. Christopher Murtaugh. In Better Angels of Our Nature, Pinker suggests that interdependent economies are the greatest incentive for world peace in the 20th century. Do you think this is holding up? I do, actually. I think it's underemphasized that Russia's aggression here is kind of illustrating a lot of those points. And it would be nice if, unlike the Norman Angel example before World War I, if, we could actually have, Putin, it'd be interesting if we had Putin basically suffering and screwing up terribly so the rest of the world doesn't have to do World War III. I think there's a real hope, possibly justified, that China will be looking at what's going on in Ukraine and being like, I want no part of that. Let's figure out how to get back on the peaceful rise, and maybe we can buy Taiwan in a couple decades thing. So yeah, I think that that's the lesson that I want to draw. I think I did a TikTok yesterday where it was just like, it's very surprising to me that, like, why are we all sort of acting as if Russia proving to be really bad at war means that everybody has to buy more weapons. I think that if Russia had taken Ukraine and achieved its goals with scary military power in 3 days, then yeah, even I would be like, shit, guess it's time to, I'd be saying time to get all our assets out of the Middle East and put them in Europe. Yeah, I mean, Russia failed here. Russia's illustrating the incredible power of all of these tools of economic warfare. Like, it's entirely possible that Russia will is providing a cautionary tale here that will actually get a lot more people to be more peaceful. That could be too hopeful and too pie in the sky, and no question for the next couple of years, U.S. defense budgets are going to remain where they are or go higher. You're absolutely right that the military-industrial complex might have more clout now, which is a goddamn shame. But yeah, I don't think that the message that everyone's taking here that, like, oh, this makes war more likely is necessarily true. A lot depends, of course, on how this conflict ends. We just don't know. So Um, so apparently we're working okay. I can hear you just fine. You have two short glitches. I'll go to no problem. Christopher, that was the why Nixon went to China when the GOP believed in trade over tariffs. Interesting. The drastic sanctions don't seem to work for a crime boss dictator, at least not yet. Can the rest of the world use economic pressure to force Russia to comply? I think it's way too early to tell what the impacts of economic pressure will be on Russia. I think they are. It seems very strong the impacts we've got so far. So I just don't know. I just don't know. The ethno-sectarian constitution the U.S. wanted Iraq to adopt has deeply embedded corruption into Iraq. Even with good leadership, it would still take several years to solve the corruption issues. I mean, it's going to take decades to solve the corruption issues, I assume. Okay, so I think we got to do a bit of a speed round here. Turkey's S-400 problem. I think I've talked a bit. I did a short on, the Israel fallacy. It's just, I think Turkey really assumes you had Erdogan in those extraordinary pictures, not quite, but pretty close to embracing the Israeli president, making, very friendly speeches next to Turkish and Israeli flags. I would 100% see that as an attempt to get back into the U.S.'s good graces. There's no question. The Israel push on Turkey's part has been of somewhat long-standing. I think after the Mavi Marmara controversy, where the Israeli military killed a bunch of Turkish activists trying to get into Gaza. I think there were 5 years they didn't. A lot of diplomatic contacts were broken off. 2016, diplomatic contacts were renewed. I don't believe business contacts have ever been broken. But Erdogan, for at least the past couple years, as I think he's recognized just how badly he fell out of the U.S.'s good graces, has been trying to rebuild his relationship with Israel. And I would think that the Turkish government saw this as a great fruition to have this very photogenic love fest between Turkey and Israel. I think Turkey is absolutely right that this Russia-Ukraine thing provides a tremendous opportunity to them. But I still think that the Turkish government just isn't getting how damaging the S-400 thing is. I think folks have pointed, India's got a lot of Russian weapons. Greece actually, I believe, has S-300s. But the thing about the S-400s is that they are meant to be, weapons of networked warfare. They are meant to be, certainly physical missiles being fired, but they're meant to operate in a new domain that, is the same domain that the F-35 works in. And if Turkey holds on to the S-400, there's just simply no way that the United States can sell F-35s to Turkey. And the United States, as I think emphasized over and over and over again, and in this presentation today, is incredibly selfish and incredibly self-focused, and we're not really interested in allies. I mean, we're interested in India, but we're not really interested in allies that can't purchase our most expensive items. And while India is, someone we want to convince to join our camp, we really don't like people who've left our camp. And Turkey, by purchasing that S-400, even if, Erdogan converts and joins the Israeli Defense Forces, it won't matter because they were part of the U.S., spending a lot of money on U.S. Weapons Club. And as long as the S-400 is there in Turkey, they can't be welcomed back into that club. And if they're not welcomed back into that club, we're not interested in doing anything else for Turkey ever. And I think that's screwed up. I think that's unjust. I think that as far as like a violation of the interests and national well-being of a country, what the U.S. did by supporting the PKK-affiliated Kurds in Syria is infinitely worse than what, in fact, buying Russian weapons might actually serve the U.S. interest if it takes more power away from the U.S. military-industrial complex. So I'm not saying that, Turkey has done something that's wrong or crazy or controversial. I'm simply saying that what he's done is the main thing. What the principles he has violated are the main principles that the U.S. cares about, which is the ability to sell weapons, expensive weapons, to people. So yeah, all of the great efforts that Turkey is making towards becoming friends with the U.S. again won't mean anything as long as they hold on to the S-400. I think that's just the case. Energy acceleration. I want to go through these a little quicker now as we're rounding an hour and 20 minutes. So I think we're going to see energy get a lot dirtier in the short term. Already, I think I've got an article or two in the description. We're going to see already. We're already seeing coal coming back in Europe in a big way. Manchin in West Virginia's got to be excited. There's a little, even enough demand for one last little fillip for West Virginia. Emissions are going to go through the roof this year and next year as we just have everybody dealing with incredible dysfunction. And also ongoing military operations. I don't know what the math is on this, but to have an ongoing conflict in Europe with heavy machinery going around getting blown up and having more of it having to be built, all of that's very energy intensive. So even just the war in Russia and Ukraine itself, Russia's going to have to, clearly, he's probably, I would assume already, looking into how to build many more newer tanks. Yeah, the industrial ramifications, the transport ramifications of war itself are probably going to bang up emissions a bit. So in the short term, yeah, there's no question. There's going to be more of everything. But in the longer term, and I think this is probably, if there's one thing you're going to click on in the description, there was this, I think it was called War Zones or something, which is just this oil and gas industry analyst. I think he's probably more green sustainability, green focused. Just talking about what an extraordinary effect this is already happening on the energy transition. I don't think I ever quite signed on to it, but I definitely talked about how a lot of folks thought that 2019 was going to be the most oil that the world ever used, ever. Like that was going to be it. I was always somewhat suspicious of this, but I was certainly excitedly sharing that possibility that 2019 would have been the peak oil and gas usage year ever. Sorry, the peak oil. Gas is very distinct, and I think gas is definitely going to keep going up for another couple of years. By the end of 2021, people were already mocking that prediction. 2020 obviously was a plummet in oil uses because of COVID, and 2021 because of all the ongoing, Delta, Omicron waves. Less oil was still used in 2021, but all of the forecasts confidently predicted that oil usage in 2022 was going to blow 2019 out of the water, and that peak oil demand had not, in fact, been reached. That seems to be no longer the case, because these prices, just by their very nature, these prices destroy demand. People decide not to take that trip. People decide not to buy that car. People decide to take public transit or ride a bike instead. And that alone is going to mean that 2022 does not exceed 2019's oil demand. I think that's already happened. And we're already we're closing in on a quarter of the way through 2022, just as the big opening. As everybody seems to have decided COVID's no longer a problem. The big opening was going to start. Now, oil and gas prices, which was already going to happen. I mean, that's just sort of a natural thing. If you have a sort of start-stop process, you're going to see a whole bunch more, what was I saying? If you have a start-stop process, you're going to get inflation. You're going to get problems restarting the machine. But now, with the prices that are as a result of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, simply folks aren't going to be that interested in buying all that oil. Gas is a different thing. Germany shutting down its nuclear plants, other concerns. Gas is still, demand is probably going to rise, but it's a huge difference. It's a huge. it's a huge shift. Like this is the energy transition, the Russia-Ukraine war. This is accelerating a lot of stuff. You know, everybody is going to sell more electric cars this year. In that article, the War Zones thing I linked below, I think pointed out that Europe and China have a lot of spare capacity for electric vehicles, and they're going to sell all of them. You know, that capacity is going to be utilized. Apparently, the United States doesn't yet have a lot of spare capacity for electric vehicles. We make a certain amount. They were all expected to be sold. But in 2023, we will have more capacity for electric vehicles. And so will Europe and China. The way this is forced change there is quite stunning. Widespread starvation, I think I talked about that earlier. So much just depends on Odessa. You know, what happens with Odessa? Is Odessa about to become a battlefield, or is it a place that can be, you know, at this point, Odessa is still a port that can be quickly rehabilitated and, you know, in the matter of weeks can probably be sending wheat across the world. But if we get that Russian attack on Odessa, could be happening now, then I think the situation gets a lot worse. I saw something this morning saying that we're not quite there, but we're closing in on as bad a wheat sort of food commodities crunch as we had in 2008. Like we're already, after just 2 weeks of conflict, we are already closing into a situation as bad as 2008, which is largely seen as leading to food insecurity in Egypt and you know, the Arab Spring eventually, you know, 3 years later. We're already closing in on a situation that's bad after just 2 weeks of this. If Odessa gets smashed, I would assume we're automatically in a worse situation. And in a worse situation that there's no real prospect of getting out of other than just a crushing recession, which is, you know, also definitely seems like the most likely result, regardless of what happens over the next week or two for the world. So that's grim. Let's see what we got for comments. All right, Christopher Murtaugh. War might not be more likely, but we'll sure buy a lot more weapons in case it does. I think that's true. Maybe that will satisfy the military-industrial complex. Seems like a recipe for disaster long-term. I agree. It's a recipe for disaster long-term. I think, been actively lobbying for, if you've seen any of my shorts or the produced video last Tuesday, like I've actively been very clear about my hope that this will actually mean that if we focus on Russia, we might actually focus a little more seriously on just Russia and iron out a lot of other potential disaster points. So I think it's possible to be hopeful about Venezuela, to be hopeful about Iran. And if we can iron those out and actually go back to really just being concerned about Russia and China, then certainly it's a dangerous, sad, overarmed situation, but maybe it's a more stable one. I mean, that's just me looking for any kind of rationalization for hope at this point. But I think, Murtaugh, you're right. I mean, absolutely, we're going to get more. I think we're absolutely going to get armed up, and it's a goddamn shame. T. Matthews, Russia's greatest miscalculation was that brute force would make Ukraine capitulate and welcome Russia as liberators, believe their own myths. Exactly. Like I said, poor man's George W. Bush. That's because the Russian military isn't made up of soldiers but over-glorified riot police. And, well, I mean, I think even if there's a lot of them, my understanding is the Chechens are seen as a pretty impressive, scary military force. Russia isn't just a bunch of, they're certainly using too many conscripts, but I wouldn't say that that's all the Russian military was. Local extreme, a very common theme in authoritarian systems from China to Saudi Arabia. Yeah, I think that's a little overstated. The Russian military still has very competent, impressive, intimidating units, whereas the Saudis don't. China, it's a pretty open question. Christopher Murtaugh, T. Matthews, sounds like Bush in Iraq in 2003, exactly. Scott Locks, sanctions don't work. Putin will get stronger, like the theocracy in Iran, Maduro in Venezuela. He lasts another 20 years. That's my belief. I'm afraid there's a real possibility of that, Scott. I sure hope not, but it's very possible. Christopher Murtaugh, they'll love us. Everybody loves America. Yeah. Fadel, Sisi cozying up to Israel have made the U.S. sell high-tech equipment to Egypt, which was unimaginable just 10 years ago. Yeah, the sort of is the qualitative military edge of Israel dissipating. It's not something I've read up on a ton, but yeah, it is interesting. Sort of, I need Fadel always reminds me I need to read up more on Egypt. Local cool stream. So Turkey is willing to look past the fact the U.S. supports Kurdish militants who have killed 8,000 soldiers, but D.C. can't make amends with Turkey because it bought a SAM system. Yeah, exactly. It's fucked up, but that's what it is. Yeah. To paraphrase John Oliver, Washington, D.C. is a massive bitch. It's true. Fadel, the U.S. dislikes Turkey for buying the S-400 the same way the U.S. hates the current Iranian leadership for ousting Mohammad Reza Pahlavi Shah. I think that's a little overstated. The thing is, like, there was never a situation where you could imagine the current Iranian leadership unousting Mohammad Reza Pahlavi Shah. Like, they couldn't, Khomeini wasn't going to be like, actually, come on back. And while I think Erdogan is certainly very committed to the idea of holding on to the S-400, I bet he could change his mind, and I bet the Turkish leadership could change their mind. I'm just not sure they quite understand what they did. T. Matthew says, I'm sure war produces more pollution than peace. No question. No question. Just the wreckage. Wreckage everywhere. I mean, look what's happening to Kharkiv. Look what's happening to Kyiv. Look what's happening to Mariupol. Alex, maybe near misses at Ukraine nuclear sites make Germany's anti-nuclear stance not so kumbaya. Yeah, I mean, you can certainly make that argument. Not an argument I like. Doesn't fit what I want, but I can certainly see why you'd make that argument, Scott. Fadel, destroying MENA has just made the locals hate Israel and the U.S. even more. The U.S. accomplished nothing. We sold a lot of weapons. That was sort of our main goal. Local Extreme, Scott Lux, I still hold the theory that the main reason for Germany's refusal to get into nuclear has more to do with refusing to be influenced by France and Russia than it is about environmentalism. Well, no, but I think Germany already had functioning nuclear power. Maybe it was balancing, trying to use Russia to balance against France, which would be sort of an interesting, maybe. Scott Locks, renewables, wind, solar, and green hydrogen make nations forever free from supply chain issues. I don't think that. I think it makes them dramatically freer from supply chain issues. Certainly, a disturbing number of countries in the world today could be shut down in a week or two without access to oil and gas. But renewables have supply chains too. I think it's an oversold issue, but nickel, lithium, these are not universally available elements. I think for a lot of the world, China is sort of the lowest cost producer of solar rigs. So, supply chains will exist, trade will remain important, but it does become a much more sustainable situation if we stop this absurd oil and gas economy. T. Matthews, the head of the Russian army has no experience with the military whatsoever. I have not done. T. Matthews, you'll have to talk about that more. I haven't done any in-depth study of the Russian army in terms of. I've just done what we've all on Twitter, just learning about morale and conscripts and whatnot. But I didn't. The head of the Russian army has no military experience. This is that Shoigu or Gerasimov? I don't know the details there. T. Matthews. Fadel, the Houthis bombing Saudi and Emirati refineries are good for Libya. Making supply even more incompetent will force the U.S. at some point to take Libya seriously. One would hope, right? One would hope. Christopher Murtaugh, maybe have Turkey send their S-400s to Ukraine along with Polish MiGs. Kill two birds with one stone. I've seen that proposed, and that seems like a good idea to me. But I don't know if it's actually going to end up working. Scott Locke, sure, the Greens and SDU, but also the CDU, CSU dislike it too. This is Nukes, I believe. T. Matthews, a common theme in the Russian military is that top military brass tend to be brass from the FSB to prevent a separate power structure. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. So the FSB being essentially the KGB, which is also something that Putin is purging at the moment. Yeah, Brando Commando says Putin has apparently fired 8 generals since the beginning of the war. So Syria on edge. I talked about this in a recent shorts and a recent live talk. I don't think I emphasized enough. Yeah, Syria has a more extreme situation of what every developing country in the world faces: higher oil prices, higher food prices. Syria is incredibly dependent on humanitarian spending, so that's not coming anymore either. It's not. Sorry. There are ongoing funding sources for Syria's humanitarian needs, but you have to understand that every year, UN folks have to go out and find the money again. And that means, looking for donations from rich countries. And especially in the context of a potential recession, the fact that, whatever humanitarian budget rich countries have, a lot of that money is now streaming towards Ukraine. That leaves Syria in kind of a rough position. That's bad. Syria not looking good. And again, I sort of was trying to find out new things about Syria this morning to talk about, and everyone's obsessed with this idea that Putin's going to bring Syrian troops to Ukraine, and I certainly don't doubt that could happen, but for it to be in numbers that are significant enough to have any impact on the war, I don't think so. I think it's just sort of a particularly trashy way to, weaponize European fear of Muslims. It's kind of grim. What I do think we should be worried about is Russian proxies in Syria being used to attack the U.S. military there. We've got somewhere between 500 and 2,000 troops just sitting there waiting to be bombed by Iran. Well, now they're waiting to be bombed by Russia. And rather than starting off a lucrative $1 trillion contract bonanza for the U.S. government, they now have the potential to start off World War III. People have pointed out that, the Russians and U.S. soldiers mixed it up before in Syria to the great detriment of the Russian mercenaries that were involved. Russia now knows a little bit more about what happens when you attack a whole bunch of U.S. soldiers and can perhaps put the right weapons and the right personnel behind it this time. I don't think they would use Russians or Russian military to do it. They would use a large attack of Syrian proxies that we've now illustrated for a couple news cycles that they certainly have. I think that's a real concern. But this is just one more aspect that makes the prospects facing Syria right now incredibly grim. The Gulf bites the hand that feeds. I've been very angry about this on Twitter. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia seem to be united around this idea that the Biden administration isn't doing enough to defer to their slaughter in Yemen. Obviously, I'm not very sympathetic to that, but I do think that the UAE and Saudi Arabia are really heavily failing to read the room by trying to make this conflict in Ukraine about their trying to make the world's outrage at Russia's invasion of a poorer, weaker neighbor into a possibility to get more support for their invasion of a poorer, weaker neighbor. It's just an incredible feat of cognitive dissonance. They just don't quite understand what they're doing there. And I think if I were the UAE or Saudi Arabia, I would be very conscious and very worried by the fact that Europe, previously one of the more selfish and risk-averse countries when it came to attacking resource providers, is making a they were already making a large push for greenery. Now it's 5x or 10x. And they've also demonstrated a willingness to band together against an oil and gas provider. And I think Russia's a much bigger oil and gas provider to Europe than the Saudis are. And what I think is kind of interesting is that I think a real, as we've seen with the U.S., the Republican-motivated U.S. push to ban Russian oil supplies, is we're now in a world where Texas has kind of discovered that, wow, this humanitarian stuff is a good way to knock out a rival. And I think maybe the UAE and Saudi Arabia should think a little harder. Obviously, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have a great reprieve and are really going to enjoy this year and the oil prices that it provides, no question. But what about 5 years from now? What about 5 years from now when 20% of the cars in the United States are electric, and 80% of the cars in Europe are electric? Russia is now some sad North Korea, or competing with Ukraine on its EU membership. Dramatically less oil and gas being provided from Russia, or maybe Russia is providing a lot of oil and gas needs, and the folks who are producing in Russia, or the folks who are producing in Texas, or certainly the folks who are producing in Canada, have been pushing this for years now. But all of a sudden realize, well, wait a second, we can drive up our prices by knocking out a market for doing the kind of thing that Russia did. And Saudi Arabia and the UAE are doing the kind of thing that Russia's doing in Yemen, and have been doing it for 6 years. So I think that the Saudis and the Emiratis should think a lot harder about the vulnerability that their actions in Yemen provide to their market. Not today. I mean, nobody's going to try and sanction Saudi Arabia over Yemen this year or next year. But 5 years from now, it's a real possibility. And unfortunately, there's very little in today's Yemen news that makes me think that this conflict won't be going on 5 years from now. So I think the Gulf should think a little bit harder about that. Fadil points out that Yemen's economy will likely collapse due to the high food prices. No question. And also a huge part of the sanctions, the blockade that screws Yemen's economy over is cooking oil. I believe kerosene, perhaps? High oil and food prices are going to further collapse the Yemeni economy, which is a goddamn shame. Venezuela releases 2 prisoned Americans. Marco Rubio attacks Biden for appeasement to Chavistas. And thoughts? Rubio is going to be a Florida politician, forever, and Florida is going to be really, really angry if the U.S. normalizes things with Venezuela. But I am hoping that the U.S. does normalize things with Venezuela. It's been interesting, interestingly fraught couple weeks, because great hope on Venezuela and Iran, and also great disappointment. Someone had asked me, so I'll just talk about this. The JCPOA now looks pretty dead, but what does that actually mean, I think, is an interesting question. So the JCPOA is, of course, it's the 5+1 or something. Russia is a signatory to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. And about a week ago, as makes a lot of sense for Russians that want the world to be insecure and dependent on their oil, Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, was like, oh, sure, we're excited. You guys almost have the JCPOA done. Sure, get it done. I'm just going to need a guarantee that Russia's trade with Iran isn't going to be blocked at all, as the whole world sanctions him. And it seems like in recent days, it seems like Russia is insisting on that more strongly, which means that the JCPOA structure, Obama's Iran nuclear deal, seems to be functionally dead. Is it, though? I just don't know. Because this is always a tremendously artificial situation. I don't think there's anything really stopping the Biden administration from being like, okay, cool, we're doing a new JCPOA. It's just between the U.S. and Iran, and we'll lift our sanctions as long as you do all the things with the IAEA that you're supposed to do. But does Biden have the political will to do that? Don't know. Because I know there's plenty of people in the U.S. Congress who'd be happy to let Russia who would be happy to serve Russia and allow them to help them kill the Iran nuclear deal. So I don't know. And if I had to guess, Scott, I think it'd be easier, more practical for the U.S. to open relations with Venezuela than with Iran. And I'd take either. I'd take both, but I'd take either too. Local extreme. I think that there's like a chance the Syrian mercs defect when they get the chance and join the Ukraine Foreign Fighting Force to get Ukrainian citizenship. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean it's quite a Ukrainian citizenship is a lot better than Syrian citizenship. It's a possibility. Don't know. I don't really. I feel like the whole Russia-Syria thing sounds more like InfoWar, and not to say that there won't be maybe a couple thousand guys that end up on the ground. I just don't see it as a particularly important or truly militarily significant development. If the civil war reignites, do you think the U.S. would side with the GNU, i.e. send weapons? That's a great question. So in Libya, if Haftar succeeds in creating a larger civil war, would the U.S. side with the official international government? I think everything would depend on like the situation, like how it evolves, like how it evolves. I just don't know. There's a chance of that, but there's also a chance that like Haftar finally gets what he wants, and the U.S. is like, "Fuck it, you guys control the oil, you're in charge." That's also a possibility. So I won't. Anything could happen. I'm sorry if this isn't a particularly satisfying presentation. Like everything's up in the air. It's really hard to say. Local extreme. Look, I don't want to tell America how to run its colonies, but for God's sake, stop accepting this humiliation from medieval dipshits. This is like if the British Empire got punked by New Zealand. Yeah, that's well. Actually, there are examples of the British Empire getting punked by New Zealand, and then eventually the British Empire saying, like the whole war with the Maori. Actually, very similar situation to the the Gulfi War with Iran, where the British Empire kept its soldiers kept getting served into this meat grinder, so the New Zealand colonists could be super racist and exterminate the Maori. And then the British military eventually were like, "Hey, you know what? Figure out how to live with the Maori. We're out." Even though, of course, they retained control of New Zealand. So yeah, that's an interesting parallel there. But yeah, no, I agree entirely with your rage on that, Loga. It's quite humiliating. It's quite embarrassing, and I think that more people are going to remember this than just the restraint, anti-U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East folks like me. The KSC and the UAE outrage reminds me of how Naftali Bennett told Zelensky to submit to Russia. The Israeli government denies that, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Israel really just desperately wants to be able to keep bombing Syria, and they are able to bomb Syria because Russia lets them. It's kind of sad that that is a higher priority for the current Israeli government than our, incredibly charismatic Jewish world leader in Ukraine. But who am I to say? T. Matthews. Isn't the central issue of the wars in the Arabian Peninsula, the Arab versus Persia historic rivalry? I think the central issue is the U.S. wants to sell weapons. It's kind of interesting because when Trump, this is a good thing that Trump did, Iran bombed, essentially took out very briefly. I've seen arguments saying as much as half of Saudi Arabia's oil industry in 2019, but just for a few hours and days, the attack on the Abqaiq refinery. It was very clarifying to Saudi Arabia, and they became a lot less interested and have actually had a lot of diplomatic contacts with Iran recently. I think that the central issue is that the U.S. wants wars in the Middle East. And I think it was a tremendous gift for peace when Iran was like, okay, let's do this. And Saudi Arabia was like, come save us, the U.S. And Trump was like, doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo, or whatever. I don't think it's, yes, that's certainly a dynamic Arab versus Persia historic rivalry. There's the fact that the current Saudi government has a lot invested in its version of religious extremism, and the Iranian government came on the scene and looked like a more impressive and actually anti-imperial version of religious extremism. that's a key deal. But like to say it's like some grand historic rivalry between Arab and Persia, some of that there is some of that in the dynamic, but like that's maybe like 5% of it versus like 60% U.S. wanting to sell weapons, 35% the Saudis desperately wanting to portray themselves as the real religious extremist while also being completely in bed with the Americans, which is not a good sell, and that resentment. So yeah, there's been a variety of Arab Cold Wars over the years. Under the Shah, I mean, Saudi Arabia and Iran were quite close, I think, for a number of decades. So yeah, it's a historic rivalry. It's I'm always very suspicious, T. Matthews, of folks who talk about historic rivalries and centuries of competition and the endless bloodshed. That's just what happens there. Because whenever you lift up the cover, you're like, oh, actually, no, these are more political decisions over the past 5 to 10 years than they are any kind of immortal rivalry or what have you. T. Matthews, the Gulf monarchies can't protect themselves. They feel betrayed over the U.S. not invading Iran. Yeah. T. Matthews, with the exception of the Kingdom of Oman, every Gulf royal family exists solely due to the British screwing over the Hashemites. And I think the Omanis as well, but we like the Omanis better. Well, no, the Omanis have been there. That's right, Loga. The Omanis, I think, have a longer period in power and time and independently of the British. T. Matthews, I've observed that most wars are economic on the outside and religious on the inside. I would disagree with that estimate. I would say that most wars are sometimes religious political in their justification, but they're mostly just always economic and political, and mostly just political. Just political choices for the way that individual politicians choose to use and manipulate nationalism or sectarianism or anything else. I think it's politics. For most conflicts, T. Matthews, I center politics, not religion or economics. All right, so I think we're closing in. I don't know what the deal is. Maybe I've just done too many live chats recently, and I am going to do another live chat on Tuesday. But I'm dragging today, folks, and so I think I might actually draw this to a close. Let me see if I just run through these really quickly. Worldwide recession, real possibility. We should be worried. DC no-fly insanity. Yeah, I gotta say, I really don't like Joe Biden's Yemen policy. I don't like his Iran policy. But for the second time now, and I don't, this is not an experience I've had at any other point in my adulthood. For the second time now, I am grateful that Joe Biden is president. Not even, rather than Donald Trump, but just there's a lot of really crazy bullshit being put forward now by Republican senators. Mitt Romney is talking about sending A-10s to Ukraine. And I just think that we're already tiptoeing or wildly dancing over these incredible, dangerous lines. I think, yes, we should be sending missiles to Ukraine, and that is the right thing to do. But goddamn, we should be lying about it. We like having the German chancellor get up there and be like, "Yeah, I'm sending all these weapons to kill Russians." Is just insane. You don't talk about that. People have forgotten what great power war is like. And people who are talking about a no-fly zone are talking about using U.S. planes to shoot down Russian planes. That's World War III. And no, it wouldn't be an automatic end of human civilization, but it would be an escalation that would make the end of human civilization dramatically more likely than it was at any point during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So yeah, that shit's insane. And Biden actually remembers the Cold War, actually was a decision maker during the Cold War, has some familiarity with what it actually means to engage in competition with a nuclear power, which very few other people in Washington, D.C. do with their advocacy of these no-fly zone nonsense. Yemen and Ethiopia, just really wanted to make the general point that Yemen and Ethiopia are humanitarian crises that are going to have less money because the money's going to go elsewhere and we might have a worldwide recession. They're going to have more expensive oil and gas, and they're going to have more expensive food. All of those situations are just going to get worse. South Korea had an election. Apparently, a somewhat unattractive right-wing figure won. Elections, they have consequences. I'm not super invested in South Korean politics. I did mean to read up in a little more detail before this presentation, and I did not get there. But yeah, so apparently we had I think the main thing to take away is, wow, what a missed opportunity. The president who's just leaving, despite the fact that in a very close election, shades of 2000, huh? In a very close election, apparently a very conservative, right-wing, hawkish, pro-business, pro-working people to death president has been elected. But apparently the much more left-leaning guy is leaving office very popular. And now, of course, a right-wing person. So Bill Clinton left office very popular, and then was followed by a right-wing guy who barely won, George W. Bush. Actually did not win, I think, the popular vote. I think that's pretty well established. So yeah, some shades of that. But I think what it is just such a sad missed opportunity, because among other things, the guy who just left, I'm not even going to attempt to say what his name was sort of very highly regarded, very popular, and very interested in peace with North Korea. That would have been a good partner for a competent U.S. president who was willing to talk to Kim Jong-un. Unfortunately, we had a very incompetent president who was willing to talk to Kim Jong-un. So it was sort of, I think we see this a lot with Iran-U.S. relations. It seems that whenever there's somebody in power in Iran who's willing to talk and work together, they get a Trump or a George W. Bush. And whenever there's someone who really wants to work together, in the United States with Iran, Obama had to deal with Ahmadinejad. Ahmadinejad, when he was a terrifying guy saying horrific things about Israel rather than the sort of ridiculous tweeter he is today. And I think you can see shades of that. That's my main takeaway as someone who doesn't have much to say about South Korean politics. It's a real shame that now that one of the more peace-friendly South Korean presidents had to be president mostly while Trump was president. And a missed opportunity there. Okay, so that's South Korea. China confused. Yeah, China is. I think there's a lot of people who are going a little too far in saying, "Oh, China is totally." I mean, treating Russia the way we treat North Korea, pretending that Russia doesn't have any independent action outside of China. I think that goes way too far. But I think it's also fair to say that China is backing Russia's play to some extent. It'll become clear in the coming weeks to what extent that is actually true. But yeah, it's interesting. Okay, cool. So I made it all the way through my list. Let me read a few more comments, and then I'm going to peace out because I'm tired. T. Matthews, religion is used mostly as a justification for its soldiers to not feel they were pawns. Yes. Christopher Murtaugh, it's all good. It's Saturday. Thanks, Christopher. I appreciate that. Father, at this point, I think the U.S. should have let Saddam annex Kuwait. How horrible as it is, the following sanctions and wars could have been avoided if the U.S. had just let it happen. I can understand why that would be the position, but I think actually the U.S. establishing the principle that folks shouldn't invade other countries was really worthwhile, and it's just really goddamn insane that the U.S. then went and broke that principle just 12 or 13 years later. I actually think it would have been what was very possible, and we opted not to do, was to kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, tell him to never do that again, and not try to get him overthrown. To simply just actually acted as a Globocop, sort of pushed Saddam Hussein out of there, and let whatever happened to Saddam Hussein happen, and just keep buying oil and gas. And because before we destroyed Iraq with sanctions, there was an Iraqi middle class who probably would have been able to push Saddam Hussein out before too long. Instead, we talked a good game about supporting insurgents that we did not support, who were slaughtered to a man, and then we had sanctions of Iraq that destroyed the middle class that might have actually been able to take over. Something they're still recovering from today. Local Kasim said the Saudis would never have accepted that. Fidel says, who cares? If the Saudis disagree with Saddam Hussein, they should have fought them themselves. That's true. Fidel says, them and what army? The Saudis would have just strong-armed the U.S. to join by making the case that Saddam was a threat to oil. True, KSA would have collapsed within a week. Saddam could have had the oil running again in a week. Many, many mistakes have been made. Anyway, thank you all for being here. There is no More Freedom Foundation without the patrons. Really, really grateful to you folks. Yeah, I think on Tuesday I'm gonna, I had a short that, my first short to hit 3,000 views, talking about Turkey's opportunity with Russia and Ukraine, and I think that's worth going live on next Tuesday, and I think that's what I'll do. And of course, next week I'm going to start reading Ray Dalio's book on global order. Someone had brought up in the Discord that Ray Dalio had a very successful YouTube video talking about global order, and I'd already read a selection from that book and found it to be not great. So I think that'll probably be my next produced video that'll hopefully have coming out a week from Tuesday. So anyway, thank you so much. Join the Discord. Logan just left a link. Yeah. Thank you all for being here, and what interesting times we live in. I need to take a nap. Y'all are the best.